This podcast episode of RealAg Radio is brought to you by Authority Strike Herbicide from FMC. With just one application, Authority Strike gives you a strong start with a powerful one-pass burn-off and keeps working later with extended weed control. Stop by your local retailer or visit ag.fmc.com/ca to learn more.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Yes, it is time for RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your Monday host, Lyndsey Smith. Thank you for joining me here on the show. I will tell you today is not as much of an Agronomic Monday as we usually have. And, well, there's a few good reasons for that. One, there's just a heck of a lot going on and a whole bunch of really important conversations that are happening that we really feel we just have to get to. But don't worry. There's definitely some agronomy happening today. So for sure, we are going to cover the fertilizer market. So Sean Haney, your regular host, was at the Top Producer Summit last week in Kansas City. He spoke there, but he also, of course, managed to sit down with several of the great speakers that they had in the lineup. You, of course, heard the Farmer Rapid Fire on Thursday, all from people at the Top Producer Summit. Just sounds like it was a fantastic event. And so one of those people, of course, that he spoke with was Josh Linville. Josh, a friend of the show from StoneX, joins us often to talk all things fertilizer markets. And well, there's a really kind of strange dynamic right now between N, K, P, you name it. There are just different issues in different global markets for these. Tariffs, of course, come into play, the relationship between U.S. and Canada. And so Josh and Sean are going to unpack all of that in our first segment of today's show. So stick around for that. I've also got Rory Cranston is on for today's product spotlight. We're going to be talking about Infinity and Infinity FX and talking about weed control in your cereals. So don't worry, there is some agronomy today. However, then we shift gears a little bit and we move a little outside of agronomy. Still very important, though. I've got two discussions at the back end of the show. One is with Dr. Ashleigh Weeden. She is what she calls, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, a rural futurist. And we discussed this idea of rural development as being not cities in waiting. So this idea that rural development means that eventually our rural areas become cities fails to actually recognize that some rural areas, well, A, are very happy being rural areas, and B, will likely continue to be for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean that you don't have any development of things in rural areas. It just looks different. And frankly, our rural areas still need to have services, infrastructure, programming, etc. And that big question of land use comes in. So, of course, this week we have a provincial election happening in Ontario. And so part of my questioning with Dr. Weeden is really about the Ontario example. But frankly, she's got some really great insight into planning in our rural areas, really for all of Canada. And that's some of the work that she does with Brandon University as well. So stick around for that. It's a fascinating conversation. Would love your feedback on that one. And another one that I'm sure we will hear from some of our audience about is my conversation with Tyler McCann. So that's in the last half of the show. Tyler, of course, no stranger to the show. He's often on our issues panel and really helps to sort of weigh in on some of the big policy issues at play in Ottawa. But CAPI, so he's the managing director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. CAPI just published phase 2, so a second report on the question of risk within the Canadian agriculture and agri-food industry. And this report, the second phase of this entire project, there is a third phase that we will talk about a little bit at the end of the interview. But it's really about quantifying, what keeps people up at night in the food and agri-food space, in the farming space. And then, of course, what can we do about it? So this phase 2 report is really more about the action items, the list, the sort of the things we really need to be doing. And this was all in the works before the Canada-US trade issues had come about. But frankly, the timing is impeccable. And as Tyler says, and we talked about this, we referenced this on Friday's show, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. And let's face it, we are in crisis on a couple different levels here in Canada as we sort out what our industries look like, what our trade relationships look like, what our trade flows look like going forward. And of course, what does it look like if we were to actually invest in ourselves and in our own industries? And so some really fascinating things coming out of this phase 2. And we're going to talk about that with Tyler. The title of the report is From Optimism to Realism. And maybe realism isn't as exciting. Sometimes it's a little more uncomfortable. It's less blue sky than optimism. But at the same time, I think we do a great job of loving this industry, of pumping its tires. But at the same time, we've got several issues that we really have to take action on if we're going to do anything about them. And that's what Tyler and I are going to discuss at the end of the show. As always, and of course, I really hope you've got feedback on this show or any of our other shows. And I will say thank you to all of you who have reached out in the past few weeks. If we don't address your feedback on the show directly, I promise you we do read everything. We often share it, talk about it amongst ourselves. If you've got criticisms, if you've got encouragement, we take it all. So you can give us a call, 1-855-776-6147, or you can zip me an email, lsmith@realagriculture.com, or of course, find me across social media at RealLoudLyndsey. Yes, I'm on Blue Sky. All right, let's take a break, and we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
It's now time for a Park Spotlight, joined by the senior agronomist with Koch Agronomic Services, Bryce Geisel. Bryce, a lot of growers, they're concerned about where the profit margins are. How can we maximize the ROI of the nitrogen investment they're making on their farms?
A big return on that investment is to keep more of that nitrogen applied in the field being available for your crops. So unless you're putting that nitrogen 3 inches down where it will be well protected, nitrogen stabilizer might be a fit to help reduce those nitrogen losses, kind of that leaching, denitrification, volatilization losses. I think one of the big things too is making sure that you're using the right kind of stabilizer for your application. There's going to be needs that you should be just utilizing a urease inhibitor like Anvil, other applications where you're using just a nitrification inhibitor like Centuro, and there's going to be other times where you're going to need both those types of inhibitors because you're trying to protect from all 3 forms of losses. So a product like Super U or Tribune are going to be great additions to be able to use those. So there's a lot to go through, but you can definitely go to our website, kochagronomicservices.ca, and you can get all that information.
I'm Lyndsey Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomist, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lyndsey Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern. Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. This is your reminder that the Canadian Crops Convention is headed to Edmonton this year from March 4th to 6th. This year's theme is Navigating Our Future and includes a fantastic lineup of knowledgeable speakers and great networking opportunities. Check out what the Canola Council of Canada and Canada Grains Council have planned and register at canadiancrops.ca. We're going to hop now to a conversation with your regular host, Sean Haney, in conversation with Josh Linville. And this, I will tell you, fascinating conversation and one that a lot of farmers are asking about. And that is what the heck is going to happen with fertilizer prices as we approach spring and through the growing season.
Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com, RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM, and we're at the Top Producer Summit in Kansas City, Missouri, and we're joined by a great friend of Real Agriculture. It is Josh Linville out of StoneX.
Yes.
Josh, how are we doing?
I'm good. Hey, short travel to get down here. It's only a couple miles. Piece of cake.
Nice stuff. Well, because I said you were a friend, I want you to have some friendly information about what's going on in the fertilizer market.
Well, it was a good interview. I appreciate you having me on.
Shoot. Okay, so farmers are obviously concerned about input price. We've seen the commodity prices start to come up a little bit, but with that also, I think there's some concerns that fertilizer markets are kind of in that same direction.
Well, and actually the fertilizer market's front-loaded this thing. It's been a little bit more of the fertilizer leading the way. Grains have been finally following a little bit higher to help offset some of those price increases. But, yeah, a lot of global events have continued to happen here over the fertilizer year, and now the market's finally started to realize it. There's a big difference from the conscience of the marketplace shifting from one calendar year to the next. You know, you go through Christmas, you go through New Year's. Spring is a long way away. You get to the new year, which we're now there. Spring is right around the corner, and that's what we're experiencing now, and prices are starting to reflect that.
Like, why does this keep happening? Like, what are the fundamentals of the fertilizer market? Is it because of the corn acres going to be? We're going to plant more corn this year in the Midwest, and that's just pulling everything higher?
It's part of it.
Okay.
And that is obviously a part of it. When you start out the new year, we started at 92 million acres of corn. Before the family and I went down to Disney World, it was 92 and a half. We moved it up a little bit, felt good about it. I wasn't gone a week, and we jumped to 93 and a half, and you started to hear people talk 94, 95, 96. That's a tremendous amount of nitrogen, phosphate, potash demand that we weren't expecting with a lot of time to prepare for the springtime. So that's one side of it, but we've already been dealing with a lot of problems globally. Nitrogen, Chinese exports of urea still aren't happening. European production is still 75% of normal. One that we didn't see coming, Iranian urea production is offline. They export about 4.8 million ton per year. So things have gotten very snug on the nitrogen side. Phosphate, China's still only about 6.6 million tons exported versus 10 million normal. Potash is really the only one that has dropped down, well supplied, etc. But even it's starting to see some appreciation over the last few weeks between tariff fears and demand growing.
But yeah, why would potash be soft?
It's well supplied. When you look at it globally, there's more than enough to go around, and there's more production coming online. You've got some I'll speak about here shortly. You've got Laos production continues to build with Chinese investments. Russia's producing more. Canada will be producing more.
BHP.
Yeah. So yeah, there's enough to go around in a very well supplied market. Really doesn't have a lot of need to go up longer term. Now, get into a situation like this where the price was historically low, it was low versus grain values, you had the tariff fears. There's a lot of reason to push that price up, but we think it's short term. After we get through pre-plant, we should see that calm down again.
How is the anticipation of tariffs and what that's going to look like? How is that impacting the market?
So February 1, it was a very, very big worry point because we're right in the thick of trying to move stuff across the borders. Both sides, farmers on Canadian and U.S. side, were going to be impacted by this. We only talked about it from the potash perspective. We didn't really talk a whole lot about it from nitrogen flowing north, phosphate flowing north. So it was going to be hurtful on both sides. This thing being delayed 30, 60 days meant we can get all the product we need across the border, or at least most of it, before the tariffs take hold. And then the tariff situation, if it happens and it turns into a long-term situation, well, that's a next year. That's a summer issue.
Yeah, we talked to the Saskatchewan Trade Minister, Warren Kading, last week, and one of the things that Warren talked about is there's a lot of potash being, we'll call it front-loaded,
yes,
getting out of Saskatchewan into the U.S.
yes,
as quickly as possible, just in case, right before planting, those tariffs were to take effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what a market's supposed to do. It's going to sit there and say, well, this is something we're worried about. Let's get ahead of it just in case. We know the product has to flow, so let's move that first, and we'll get ours done second.
I guess... What do producers need to know then heading into planting? Just expect higher prices?
I would.
Get it on farm?
Yeah, it's going to be one of those situations. It's not great. Farmer profitability for this year does not look fantastic. Now, fortunately, grain prices are going higher, but we're seeing inputs go up as well. So it's a little bit of a wash type situation. Unfortunately, it's not a backdoor situation. We're looking out the window and trying to make decisions. The fertilizer markets, this is a global thing. We're not talking about domestic production. We are talking about exports globally. We're talking about production globally. So when we see this and we get angry, don't be upset with everything here. We're doing all we can, but we are still dependent on that world market. It's a world product.
Can you bring some good news? What's your best good news right now?
Best good news is when you look at potash and you look at it in relation to grain, it is still some of the best values that we have ever seen.
That's that ratio you do.
Yeah. Farmers are spending far less bushels of corn or whatever to pay for their potash. It's one of the best ones. In fact, a few weeks ago, it was setting all-time records based on the historical data we had. So potash is doing some work. Phosphate's kind of the opposite end of that. Nitrogen's been moving higher, but potash, it's very well priced.
When you look at your North American usage amounts, how much does like a 1 million acre movement in corn planted, how much does that change things? Is it significant, or is it like, how much does corn acreage need to move for you to be like, oh boy, okay, I take notice of that?
You probably need to start moving more like 2 to 4 million acres.
Okay.
Before it really starts to move the needle. That's not to say that it doesn't add, several 10,000, a couple 100,000, but when you look at the size of the market, that's not massive, right? It's something we can do as long as we have a little bit of heads up. Now we start to move those kind of acres right before the start of spring season. That's different. We've run out of time to get that extra product in place.
Farmers are trying to avoid disaster, sort of like how we're trying to avoid the disaster of the cleanup crew here in the car. Almost getting bowled right over. From a Canadian perspective, are there any getting on farm supply issues we need to be aware of heading into 25?
Not yet. I think the tariff thing needs to be watched. Like I said, we spent a lot of time talking about potash flows into the U.S. What we didn't talk about is if there are reciprocal tariffs on the U.S. products. Phosphate. We talk about potash, 25% of potash, that'd be a big number. Well, not really. Think about how high priced phosphate is and put 25% on top of it. That is devastating.
Yeah. Josh, really appreciate it. I know you're about to go on stage here at Top Producer. Thank you so much for taking some time for us.
Absolutely. Anytime, man.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back with more of RealAg Radio right after this.
Every farmer defines success differently, and every farm has its own unique challenges. Corteva Biologicals is partnering with Canadian farmers for their success, offering unique solutions that improve and protect crops from start to finish, based on each field's needs. Using proven predictable solutions across all crop stages, Corteva Biologicals helps build healthy, productive, and profitable farms. Corteva Biologicals, we're growing together. Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BSF Canada.
Every year, humic loss makes it harder for crops to absorb applied nutrients. Resurge from Helena is a low-dust granule that delivers humic compounds to improve nutrient uptake and plant growth. The Resurge granule's superior hardness and uniformity withstands pneumatic applications, allowing for even distribution in your fertilizer and across the acre. Energize your soil and elevate your crops. Contact your Helena representative to learn more. Always follow label instructions and check registration status before use.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. It is time for today's product spotlight. We're going to be talking about Infinity and Infinity FX. Joining me is Rory Cranston, Technical Strategy Lead with Bayer Crop Science. How are you, Rory?
I'm doing great today. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Staying warm. That's the important part this time of year. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Now, but of course, before we know it, we'll be hitting the fields, and this is prime time for planning right now. So we're focused on weed control. We're talking today about a Group 27 product. What do we need to know about Group 27?
Yeah, that's a real interesting and can be a real big question, especially in the cereals markets with Infinity FX. They've really been the only Group 27 on the market for quite some time. And, we've seen some new ones come into the market. And I think we need just to be aware a little bit about 27s because they're quite broad and can be quite tough. And so Group 27s broadly kind of fall into two different categories. The broadleaf non-selective ones, so meaning they only have broadleaf activity. So we'd know these, for example, Infinity FX. And then there's ones that have grass or selective activity. And so we know of some that have entered in the market there. And there's benefits and drawbacks to both. So sometimes when you have grass activity, some of the things you need to watch out for are going to be your tank mix partners and also soils, because one thing Group 27s all share is they're very water soluble or soil soluble. And if it gets into the soil, what can happen is you can have a crop response as well too. And if you think about how Group 27s work, on pigmentation and maybe reducing photosynthesis, they can also have an impact on your Group 2 ALS graminicides as well too, just what they need for translocation. So, the benefit of having grass activity there of another mode of action, but if you don't use it right, can impact you. Whereas sometimes just having the broadleaf only specialist can be very important too, and just improve your tank mix flexibility in a lot of cases as well too.
So as we approach the season, as you've highlighted, there are several things to think about with our Group 27s. What are some of the benefits and features of Infinity and Infinity FX that growers should prioritize when they're sitting down to pencil out those weed management strategies?
Well, that's a great question. And the way I'd like to say it is, Infinity FX is one of those, if they were a person, is a person that you always want at a party kind of deal. They're always consistent. They always bring a great amount of activity. They always mix well with a lot of the friends there, that they don't have any antagonism or any aspects there. They don't mess up the place when they get there. So when I say that is, they've got a great activity on a lot of those tough to control weeds that we see there. It's a true resistance management of, it's got a good rate of 27, a good rate of 6, Infinity FX, a good rate of Phloxipure Group 4 in there. So it's consistent on what it does. It doesn't antagonize any of your graminicide partners in there. It doesn't do anything like that. And then in crop response, it just doesn't mess up the house it's in a lot of cases. So there's a few benefits there. Kind of the four that kind of jump to mind is that whole, consistent, safe tank mix flexibility, and that herbicide resistance management as well too, with that 3 modes of action in there.
We have to value our good party guests.
Let's face it,
right? We should value such things. Okay. Now you did mention resistance management. I want to touch on that just a little bit more. Obviously a huge question for growers as they make decisions, how different products fit into a resistance management strategy. How does Infinity FX fit in there?
Infinity FX is definitely one that fits in there really well. And even just going back to base Infinity of 2 modes of action that have some great synergies together, Group 27, Group 6. Everything that we have basically in that cereals market is baked in together in a lot of cases right now, where they have a true synergy where 27s reduces the abilities of plants to deal with a toxic molecule, and Group 6 actually raise that toxic molecule. So they work really well together, that they kind of got that little based in resistance, and resistance to 6s are really low here. But then adding in that Group 4 as well too with Infinity FX, that you can have 3 modes of action really working well. And the nice thing that I really like about Infinity FX of just the rates that are in there is it's not true resistance management if that individual active ingredient doesn't control those weeds, and they're at a great weight for controlling it as well too. So it's we get a lot of good activity plus the true synergy reaction with it. And it's going to be our stance with a lot of our 27s that we don't want them going down without a Group 6 to utilize that strategy and also protect the Group 27 as well too.
Mm-hmm. It's got to be effective to work. All right. Yes. Rory, thank you so much. For growers who are interested, want to know more, where can they go for more information?
You can go to our Bayer Crop Science website or to their local sales rep for sure.
All right. Thank you, Rory. We'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
Growing corn? With Envita, you can cut your nitrogen and maintain yield, or maintain nitrogen and increase yield. Envita takes nitrogen from the air and turns it into nitrogen for your corn. It provides a right place, right time source of nitrogen to maximize your yield. Farmers who use Envita see healthier plants, bigger cobs, and less tipback. Envita is guaranteed to add more bushels to every treated acre. Start growing with Envita. Visit azotic.com to learn more. That's AZOTIC.com.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. For every acre, every row, every seed, precision wins. Every time. Only Seedmaster delivers unmatched accuracy for better yields and bigger profits. Seedmaster, driven by precision, leading the way in seeding innovation. Well, if you didn't know, on Thursday, Ontario will go to the polls for a provincial election. Doug Ford has a majority, seems to be the favorite, likely will hold on to that majority, but we'll see what happens. But one of the things that certainly has been at issue for the last few years within Ontario and during Ford's majority government is certainly land use and specifically rural development. So to ask some of the questions that I have about how Ontario broaches the subject of rural development, here is my conversation with Dr. Ashleigh Weeden, and we talk about, well, whether or not rural development is actually an oxymoron. I'm Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture and RealAg Radio, and joining me now is Dr. Ashleigh Weeden. She's a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, also doing her postdoc at Brandon University on with the Rural Development Institute, and considers herself a rural futurist, which I cannot wait to ask her about. Welcome here, Ashleigh.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right. What is a rural futurist? I love that.
Yeah, well, I'll be perfectly honest, it started as slightly tongue-in-cheek, because the work that I was doing and have been doing for, most of the last 10 to 15 years has been focused on foresight, futurism, sort of how do we build the preferable futures that we want to see, not just sort of what we think could happen or is most likely to happen, but where do we want to go? So I work with leaders and organizations and communities across the country on developing those preferable futures in the past there. But I was always confronted with sort of the frustration that my wonderful pals in policy and planning seemed to think that the future was always in cities and that urbanists could only be the ones with the claim on the future. And so it kind of started as a slightly little bit of a tongue-in-cheek and see like there are futures in other places, and then became sort of a calling card. And that's really what the work that I do is. I primarily focus on what the future of rural looks like, not just sort of what might come at us, but how do we create and craft that future that we really want to see in rural places.
So, and to that end, and I love how you capture that, because, some people might say, well, rural development is an oxymoron, right? If we want it to stay rural, why are we developing it? So, but development does happen in rural areas, but it looks different. So from your perspective, we are talking, of course, in the context of an oncoming Ontario election at the end of February. You are based in Ontario, although, as you say, you work across Canada. But from that perspective, what has rural development in Ontario sort of looked like, let's say, in the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, and you're absolutely right that one of the main bugaboos that a lot of people have with rural policy and rural research and stuff is that certainly in the Western context, that successful rural development policies and programs often seem to look like urbanization. There's this notion that rural places are cities in waiting or failed cities. And so most of I'm going to get real nerdy and technical here for a second, but most of the policies that we aim at rural places are aimed at creating something that we call agglomeration benefits. So the idea that happens in a lot of urban centers where you just have a lot more collisions because there's a lot more people there. So you have people kind of coming into each other and things happen because there's more density there, more people there. And so we aim these policies at places that are by their very nature low density and try to sort of create fake agglomeration benefits, try to create as if those things were there, instead of saying, wait a minute, what if we actually looked at and treated rural places as places that have a right to exist in their own determination with their own goals and aspirations, and what works in those communities rather than trying to superimpose urban policies in rural places, or even policies from other rural places, like rural Saskatchewan and rural Newfoundland are incredibly different. And so what works in one place may not actually work at all or cause, harmful effects in another. And so I'm a much bigger fan and proponent in my work of what I call place-based policy, which is what happens if we look at sort of the unique overlying dynamics of, physical geography, population demographic, socioeconomic things that are going on, history, relationships, interconnectedness to other places. And how then do we figure out what works in that place? And that helps get us out of this sort of often very unproductive urban rural, binary, this idea of it's us versus them, rather than saying like, hey, we're all these important nodes in the nervous system of the country. And we need all of these different places to function and work as best as they do at the apex of their existence, rather than trying to be somewhere else. So all to say that I work towards a framework that I think is starting to pick up a little bit of attention and led by some colleagues out east at Karen Foster and sort of slightly north at Jennifer Jarman, about the right to be rural. So what happens then if we change our notion of service delivery or policy development from these very narrow categories of like, this is rural and this is urban, to your postal code really shouldn't determine the quality of your life. And I think that's a far more appealing way to think about things, rather than how do we shoehorn these places into something they just aren't, and instead create these vibrant, vital, and meaningful opportunities in the place as it is and as it wants to be.
And so now your focus is on the policies that sort of get us there, right? So what does that look like in planning? You mentioned sort of, focusing on what makes some place unique and what's unique to that area. So thinking about Ontario, we've got, significant pressure on housing, for sure. We've got, lots of population that spills out from the cities. What does policy for rural development look like in Ontario that's unique perhaps to somewhere else?
Yeah, I think, it's a really interesting example, and I'm going to be maybe a little bit picky here on our friends at the OFA, that rural development really didn't make it into their list of priorities until I think 2016. And so we kind of have this interesting thing happening, I think, now, where maybe industries and organizations that thought of themselves as sort of the voice of rural places, which may or may not be true. Like, actually, agriculture may or may not be the primary economic driver in a lot of rural regions. Often it's manufacturing or tourism and hospitality, and agriculture isn't in that prime place that it imagines it is sometimes, and sometimes it is. But what we've discovered is that often what's good for industry, and that's whatever industry you're talking about, whether that's manufacturing or agriculture as an industry, may not actually be all that good for the communities those people call home. So as we see things like increasing intensification of agriculture, so where you might have had 5 or 6 individual operations across a span of land, we now have a single landowner, or people that are buying up lots of lands and having larger operations. And then we have very small farms versus very large farms. Well, that may be good for the agricultural output. Is that good for the community if we have a structure where things like school funding is based on number of bums and seats, right? Or can you maintain a local grocery store with the number of people that are living there? So fewer people living and working on the land kind of has these knock-on effects elsewhere. But we get into this really unproductive, I think, debate between farming versus industry versus housing, right? Like that it has to be one or the other, and these are all mutually exclusive. And one of the things I like to work with, and this came out of discussions at the Rural Ontario Municipal Association a couple of weeks ago, was that it isn't either or. It's, are we making the best possible use of the resources that we have that leave the greatest number of opportunities open to us in the future, and protect what we know we can't replace? And so one of these things, when we're looking at making these decisions over what we're going to allow or use for different rural land bases, is how are we making those decisions with our eyes wide open? And I think that's where we need to have greater transparency over the reasons for certain decisions, and to invite different voices into that process. For example, we're seeing some really interesting things happen around Northern Ontario, where communities that figure they can't find the land or the space to build affordable housing are finding private landowners or donating significant acreages to that, versus where we see, kind of in other parts where land is being expropriated in ways that we're not exactly sure for. And I think it all boils down to, we need to have a much clearer picture of the decisions we're making and why, so that one voice doesn't outweigh all the others, and we can make really good community decisions. And that it isn't a case of sort of one thing or the other, because we can look at really great partnerships from different organizations. Right? I think of like the Ducks Unlimited with the dairy farmers and how they've managed to create these really great partnerships around stewardship of land on farms that may be better put into conservation and how to manage that versus into agricultural production. But they happen side by side, not as an either or thing. And I think we can think about the same things in terms of housing or other forms of development, that it doesn't have to be the image that people have in their mind that it's mutually exclusive, but that what doors are we opening and what doors are we closing as we make these policy decisions. And right now, I think we're making a lot of really reactionary policy decisions that are either don't build anything anywhere ever, or build everything all the time, pave over everything right now because we need to do things fast because we've missed the last 40 years of decision making, instead of being very thoughtful and purposeful about how we're going to make these decisions. Because as we all know, right, once prime agricultural soil has been built on, it takes 150 years to come back to that state. So it is farmland loss when we build over farmland. And we can't drink or eat concrete. So, if we're polluting water systems or we're not managing those appropriately or managing our land base appropriately, then we're going to be really in trouble. And so I think these conversations also happening in the context of what's happening south of the border with us, I think you're having a lot more attention on these policy decisions of what we're doing with our natural resources and with our land.
Mm-hmm. So I'm an action item kind of person. What do you hope we sort of see, regardless of throughout this election cycle, let's say, but certainly going forward in, whoever may be premier after, or if it is the Ford government yet again, what do you hope happens policy-wise, once we head into March and into the year ahead?
I think I always have three key questions for people that are running for elected office or senior staff positions or any of those, which when we're talking about rural policy, which is, first, do we value rural places? And then I'm like you, action oriented, prove it, right? Like, so do we value rural places, and how can you demonstrate that to me? And I would argue that in a lot of the decisions that we've been seeing made at the provincial level, federal level, all orders of government, that our understanding and assessment of the way we value rural places is primarily around what can we exploit from them, what can we extract from them, or what do they do for other people, rather than what do they do for rural people and rural places themselves. So that's my first priority, is like, how do you prove, or how do you show that you value rural places in your decisions and investments? The second one is there such a thing? Do our people who are campaigning for office believe in the right to be rural? Is there a fundamental understanding that your postal code shouldn't determine whether you have access to a healthcare center, to education, to opportunities to build a meaningful life? That the fact that because you live rurally should not diminish your ability to access services and economic opportunity in our province and in our country. And again, as you said, prove it. So how can we see this in action through not just sort of the words of our leaders, but through what they decide through policy? And then the third one is, who has the seat at the table? So I'm always interested to find out who our provincial leaders or our federal leaders, particularly during an election campaign, who is it that they imagine when they think of people in rural communities? And I think it benefits us all when we take a very close look at that. It's sometimes nice to be thought of as the particular voice of rural or whatever. But if you look around a room and there's a lot of people that look and sound like you, and not a lot of challengers, not a lot of different faces or different opinions, different industries represented, then we end up with poorer policy decisions. So who gets to be represented and who gets to decide what happens next to these communities across rural Ontario is really important, particularly when we break it down to understanding that rural southwestern Ontario versus the near north versus northern and more remote Ontario all have very different experiences, needs, and priorities. And when we lump them all together and to sort of that rural, remote, and Indigenous kind of line that comes out in a lot of policy statements, we miss the richness and the needs and the appropriateness of what we're doing in those communities. So my three questions is always, when we're developing a rural policy agenda for this election and the coming government, is, do we value rural places? Is there a right to be rural? And who gets to decide what happens next?
All right. Dr. Ashleigh Weeden, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Lots of food for thought. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
Co-op knows your community because we live here too. Our teams are your trusted partners with a range of expertise to help support your entire farm operation. And we're giving back. In the past 5 years, Co-op has invested over $1.1 billion in the prairies through building, upgrading, and expanding local facilities. And we've returned over $1.17 billion to Co-op members in the prairies. Co-op, we're all building something for the future. Here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more at coop.crs/farm.
Before you get back in the field this year, spend some time with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com. Get all the information you need on hybrid selection, planting depth, crop inputs, and more from a wide range of industry experts. A massive library of video content is available on demand when you need it most. Spend your time outside of the field, inside the classroom, with the Corn School on RealAgriculture.com.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by Alpine Liquid Fertilizers, your full-season crop fertility specialist from start to finish. I'm Lyndsey Smith with Real Agriculture and RealAg Radio, and joining me now is Tyler McCann. He's the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Welcome here, Tyler.
Great to be with you, Lyndsey.
All right. Well, it's not the issues panel, although you do join us, of course, on the radio show often. This time, we're going to talk specifically about a report that CAPI's just put out. This is, though, phase 2. So before we get into this new report, let's back up a step, Tyler, if you would. Set up for us this sort of reporting structure and what was phase 1 before we talk about phase 2.
So to step even before that, what's been driving the report and some of the work that we've been doing at CAPI lately is a recognition that we need to better understand the risks that are in front of the sector. And, this work started before a change in U.S. administration, but was driven by this recognition that there is this great untapped potential in Canadian agriculture. We do a lot of things well, but we could probably do a lot of things better. And much of what stands in the way are the risks that are keeping people up at night, the risks that are holding back either investments or change in the sector, but we don't really have a good understanding of what those are. And the other reality is often in the sector, we think in value chains or we think in our regions, and we don't do a good enough job thinking across agriculture and agri-food. And so we wanted to go out and basically ask the sector, what's keeping you up at night? So phase 1 was a survey where we went out and we asked farmers, but we also asked kind of other industry stakeholders. We asked government, civil society, and other actors, what are the risks that you're worried about? We put those results out last year, this work that we did with the Angus Reid Institute. But then phase 2 has been, okay, so how do we dig a little bit deeper to understand what do those results really mean? And so we held a series of dialogues in 2024 in the fall. We went back and looked at some other work that we've done and others have done, and we've tried to connect those dots now into this report, which has just come out.
Mm-hmm. So it's called the Agri-Food Risk Report. We will have a link, of course, on realagriculture.com, but you can, of course, find it on CAPI's website as well. So we are going to go over sort of some of the findings and some of the outcomes, but do really encourage everybody to go and take a look. There's lots there that we won't all get to in this interview, of course. But let's dig in a little. One of the things that I sort of noticed is, as you said, you sort of captured what industry, what farmers, et cetera, are worried about, but also that there was this incredible optimism for the sector. And perhaps I am being influenced by what's happened in the last month. However, so I feel a little bit like maybe some of this optimism is misplaced. How do you broach that from what you took in for this report?
Yeah, and the title of the report is From Optimism to Realism, and it's to try and get at that point. And again, this is something that we took away last fall based on the results and the feedback that we'd got, and again, I think goes beyond just the current challenging environment that we're in. But we do have this issue where we asked questions around what are the risks that you're worried about, and then how confident are you in the government or the private sector's ability to mitigate those risks. And what we found is that people are concerned about risks. These are things that are top of mind. But we also heard that in general, people are optimistic about the future. And so it's been a bit of a challenge that's informed a lot of the dialogues that we've had around this is how do you reconcile the fact that we are very optimistic, but we're also very concerned about risks, and we're not very confident that we can manage those risks. And I don't know if that is just the spirit of agriculture and of farmers and understanding that you need to go out and you need to put your crop on the ground, even though you could face drought or flood and something that could wreck it, but you need to do that work anyways. I don't know if that is what we're seeing in these results, but I think it also is unfortunately a bit of a barrier to action at times, because we can be too optimistic about the future, and we may not take seriously the risks that we're facing and our need to act on them. And
I appreciate and we'll talk a bit about sort of the action items from this, of exactly that. I think that, you and I were at the Future of Food event just last week, happening here in Ottawa, which I think had a good balance of, yes, there's lots of things to be optimistic about, but exactly that, unless we're actively pursuing those opportunities, they're not just going to fall in our lap. We have to actually be trying to solve some of the challenges ahead of us.
That's right. And I think that there's always this dynamic. Canada's Ag Day is all about celebrating Canadian agriculture. But I always get a bit frustrated by the language around we need to tell our story better. Because yes, we need to tell our story better, but we also need to do things differently. And we also need to act, and we also need to change the things that we know that are there. And one of the things that came out in a lot of this work is that people aren't surprised about the risks facing the sector. We heard that, we presented the findings, we asked different people participating in the discussions, did these resonate with you, or are you surprised by anything? And by and large, people aren't surprised. By and large, we know that these are the challenges that we face, but yet we struggle to do anything about it. And so I think that there was this imperative before to say we need to do a better job acting. Clearly, there's an imperative now because the risks are worse. And we've seen this already in some survey work that we've done with Real Agri Studies, where farmers are telling us in January 2025, 65% of farmers think that this year is going to be more risky than last. We know that this is going to get out, and this is going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Now, several times on the issues panel, one thing we really appreciate, Tyler, that you bring in is this perspective of the agri-food, the food processor space. Because I think often, yes, sometimes we don't think nationally, sometimes we think too regionally, sometimes, honestly, within the sectors, we think, we get siloed into our own little. So from the food processor, the agri-food portion of this, what are some of those challenges that were identified through these reports?
One of the things that was kind of interesting to look at is, by and large, policy and regulatory issues are a challenge for everyone. And that kind of shines through in a lot of what we see. Obviously they worry less about farm income and debt, but they still have some concerns around input affordability and other issues. And I think overall they've got this kind of broader concern around what I would consider more of the competitiveness type issues, right, labor challenges like that. But I think that one of the things that we heard is that a lot of the solutions do get to be the same at the end of the day. Again, they may be kind of a different spin on them, a different take on them, but getting government that works better is something that's in everyone's interest. Getting a more coherent policy agenda is something that works in everyone's interest. And so that's something that I think that, again, as much as we talk about the differences, there are also a lot of similarities too at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. So in looking at that, so this is phase 2 from optimism to realism. There's a third part to this, right? That will move forward this year as well. But in this sort of second part, there are some discussions of those action items of what CAPI sort of sees as a possible path forward on some of these. So what are those action items that really we need to see action on?
Yeah, and so I think that we tried to highlight two things that we think that there's broad agreement on. One, we need a meaningful ag policy framework that realizes the opportunities and drives growth and sustainability for the sector. That's something that we heard broadly. And the second one, that we need a more cohesive approach to risk management that looks at risk management beyond risk management programs on the farm, but looks at risk management across the sector. And we tried to take that and the findings from the survey and what we heard through the consultations that we did and turn it into 4 key takeaways. 1, we need governments to do less, but do that work better. We need the sector to focus on collaborating, not competing. We need to find ways to work better together. We need clear roles for government and for the sector. That risk management, I think, only really works if we've got a very good understanding of where everybody stands on it. But we also need clear, measurable, realistic goals. We need to have that sense as to where are we going? How ambitious are we being? And we need to use that to really set the stage for kind of the actions that we're looking for at the end of the day. And I always feel the need, Lyndsey, to say the fertilizer target, I think, set this kind of bad cloud over targets. There are good ways to do it. It does include kind of a clear sense of working together to set those targets. It does include a sense as to an action plan of how you're going to achieve them. And it does include this recognition that they need to be realistic and achievable. And so I think we need to move past kind of our aversion to ambition and direction and embrace that, but understanding that we can't let government do it all. The private sector, the industry, farmers, food processors, others have a real important role to play. But all of that can come together to help us deal with this risky future that we're facing.
Part of that, as you mentioned, an ag policy framework. We are coming up on sort of that every 4 years sort of review and perhaps rollout. But we're also at an interesting juncture with this government, of course, currently prorogued. This Liberal government may fall as in March when things reconvene. And yet some of that, of course, behind the scenes work continues, obviously, regardless of what's happening politically. But I mean, timing wise, how important is it then for some of these topics, some of this path forward to be included in these discussions that are going to happen, right now, this summer into this fall?
Yeah, it's really important, Lyndsey. And we've heard a lot of people say in the context of the threats from the United States that we can't let a good crisis go to waste. But I really am worried that we are. But this is the right opportunity. We've got all of these things happening. We've got this motivation from a disruption in this trading relationship that's core to the success of the sector. We've got this kind of changing landscape around the world. We've got all of these other pressures. And then we have negotiations starting on a new policy framework that really ties up billions of dollars in public investment for the sector. This should be the moment for us to kind of pump the brakes for a minute and say, okay, what do we need to do better to better be able to manage the risks and seize the opportunities that are in front of Canadian agriculture? Because the status quo is not good enough anymore. We should be optimistic for the future, but we need to be realistic about the challenges that we face and the need to do things differently at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Let's not let a crisis go to waste. Quote of the day, everybody. Okay. Tyler, where can people go to find this report and, of course, all others with CAPI? But what is the CAPI website that we can send them to?
Yes, please go to www.capi-icpa.ca to get the report. Also take the opportunity to sign up for our email list where you can get this and everything else that we do, and follow us on all of those social media channels to stay in touch with all of the great things we've got going on at CAPI. And Lyndsey, I should say, this report was made possible by the good support of the Global Institute for Food Security and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and we're very grateful for the support that they offer.
Always important. All right. You heard him. Go check out this report and let us know what you think. As always, get in touch. We love to have your feedback, and we'll work that in perhaps into an upcoming issues panel that Tyler joins us on. All right, Tyler, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you, Lyndsey. Have a great day.
Well, that does it for another edition of Real Ag Radio here on Rural Radio, Channel 147, Sirius XM. I am Lyndsey Smith. Thank you to Josh Linville, Ashleigh Weeden, Rory Cranston, and, of course, Tyler McCann for joining me on today's show. I'll be back Wednesday with Calvin Hepner with our special live edition of Real Ag Radio from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture annual meeting, brought to you by Cooperators. So check it out. We'll talk to you Wednesday. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this RealAg Radio podcast episode, brought to you by Authority Strike herbicide from FMC. Tackle tough weeds like kochia, cleavers, Russian thistle, and pigweed with the dual power of 2 Group 14 modes of action. Visit your local retailer today or visit ag.fmc.com/ca to find out more.